She had $83, a horse she didn't fully trust, and a road behind her she had no intention of traveling again. Evelyn Caro rode into Cimarron Valley on a Tuesday in late October of 1878 with dust on her coat and something harder than dust in her chest. The particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from riding, but from years of being someone else's version of yourself. She almost didn't stop. She almost kept going straight through that valley and out the other side, into whatever nameless place would take her. But then she saw the flowers, wild and improbable, blazing gold and violet across a hillside where nothing had any business being beautiful, and her horse slowed before she told it to. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The road into Cimarron Valley was not a welcoming road. It ran narrow and rutted between two ridges of pale rock, climbing just enough to fool you into thinking the land was going to open up into something generous, then leveling off into a flat, sun-beaten stretch of scrub and hard-packed earth that seemed to go on longer than it had any right to. The October wind cut sideways through the gaps in the rock, not cold enough to be honest about itself, just cold enough to make a person feel unwelcome. A few stunted cottonwoods marked the places where water had once bothered to show up. Most of them were leaning away from the valley, as if they'd thought about leaving and never quite managed it. Evelyn Caro had been riding since before sunrise. She was 31 years old, which meant she was old enough to have stopped believing in easy things, but not so old that she'd given up on specific things entirely. She kept a ledger in her saddlebag, not from habit so much as the fact that ledgers made sense to her the way almost nothing else did. Numbers held still. Numbers told you exactly what you had and exactly what you owed and didn't try to convince you of something they weren't. She had been keeping books since she was 17, first for her father's dry goods store in Denver, before he sold it out from under the family without mentioning it was happening, and then for a series of businesses in Pueblo, a freight company, a feed supplier, 2 different land offices, each one run by a man who paid her less than he would have paid a man, and praised her more than he would have praised a man, and somehow thought both of those facts canceled each other out. She had worked for Theodore Marsh last. Theo, who had thought that paying her wages meant he was entitled to tell her who she could speak to and when, who could call on her and under what circumstances, who had once sat across from her at his office desk and said, with the specific confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered, "I think we both know where this is heading, Evelyn." She had looked at him for a moment, at his side-parted hair and his gold watch chain and his absolute certainty, and she had said very quietly, "Mr. Marsh, I know exactly where it's heading. I'm leaving." And she had taken her coat from the hook on the wall and her ledger from the desk drawer, and she had walked out, and she had not gone back except once to collect the 2 weeks' wages he owed her, which she'd collected in person and in exact change, coin by coin, from his front office while his clerk watched with his mouth half open. That had been 3 weeks ago. She had enough money for a month, maybe 6 weeks if she was careful. She had a letter of introduction from a freight operator in Pueblo named Crenshaw, who was one of the few men she'd worked for who seemed to understand that competence was competence regardless of the body it came in. The letter said she was the finest bookkeeper Crenshaw had worked with in 20 years of business, and that anyone who hired her would be getting the better end of the deal. She'd read it herself. He'd shown it to her before sealing it, and she'd been embarrassed by how much it meant to her that someone had put that in writing. She'd thanked him and looked at the floor, and he'd said none of that, and that had been the end of it. She was headed for Cimarron Valley because a woman she'd met briefly in a Pueblo boarding house had mentioned it. Small place, but it's growing. They've got freight coming through regular now. Probably need someone who can keep the books straight. It wasn't much of a reason to ride 4 days into the high desert, but Evelyn had learned that most reasons weren't much when you got down to them. You went where there was work. You kept your ledger current and your expectations honest, and you didn't wait for a better reason because better reasons had a way of not materializing. She came over the last ridge at around midday and got her first proper look at the valley. It was bigger than she'd expected. That surprised her. She'd been prepared to be underwhelmed and found instead a wide, bowl-shaped stretch of land with a creek running through the middle of it, cottonwoods and willows marking the water's path in a dark green line against the pale scrub. She could see the town from the ridge, maybe a dozen buildings clustered at the creek crossing, a church steeple, the long, low silhouette of a livery stable. Scattered across the valley floor were ranches, some modest, some larger, most of them looking like they'd been built by men who wanted to stay but weren't entirely sure the land was going to let them. Cattle moved in slow clusters in the distance. The sky was enormous and pale blue and slightly hazy with dust, the way western skies got in October when the summer heat was finally letting go. She started down the ridge road, and that's when she saw the flowers. They were on a hillside to her left, set back from the road maybe a quarter mile, growing on land that had no business supporting anything so extravagant. The rest of the hillside was the same pale rock and brown scrub she'd been looking at for 4 days. But this section, irregular, roughly the size of a large room, was blazing. Yellows and deep purples and a dusty orange she didn't have a name for, scattered thick enough that from a distance the whole patch seemed to glow against the dry hillside. She pulled her horse up without meaning to. She sat there for a moment just looking. Then she noticed the ranch below the hillside. A modest place, stone foundation house with a plank addition built off the back of it, a barn that was newer than the house and built better, a set of corrals with good solid post and rail fencing, a kitchen garden that had gone to brown stalks for the season but still showed evidence of having been cared for. The whole property had a particular quality she'd noticed on very few ranches. Nothing was falling apart, but nothing was being shown off either. Everything was exactly what it needed to be. There was a man working a section of fence along the near pasture. She couldn't see him clearly from the road, just the movement of someone working steadily, setting a post. Her horse was thirsty. She was thirsty. She had a canteen that was down to the last third of warm, flat water, and the creek crossing was still another mile ahead. She told herself that was why she turned off the road. The man working the fence was shorter than she'd expected from a distance, maybe 5'10", built solid through the shoulders in the way that came from years of actual work, rather than the kind of stockiness some men were simply born with. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, brown from the sun, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had a week's worth of beard on it. He was wearing a worn canvas coat and driving a post with a mallet, in the particular rhythm of someone who'd done it so many times the motion was almost thoughtless. He didn't look up when she rode toward him. He heard her coming. She could tell by the slight pause in his swing, but he finished the stroke before he turned. He looked at her. His eyes were gray and they were direct without being rude. "Help you?" he said. "I was hoping you might let me water my horse," Evelyn said, "and refill my canteen if you're willing. I've been on the road since before sunup, and the creek's still a ways out." He looked at the horse, then back at her. "Trough's by the barn," he said. "Help yourself." "Thank you." She started to turn the horse, and he went back to his post. She'd gotten maybe 20 feet when she stopped. She didn't entirely understand why she stopped. She turned back. "Are those yours?" she said, nodding toward the hillside. "The flowers." He looked up the hill. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled differently. "Yeah," he said. "What are they doing there?" He seemed to consider the question as if it were more complicated than it sounded. "Growing," he said. She waited because that couldn't be the whole answer. It turned out it was. He turned back to his post. She watered her horse and filled her canteen from the pump beside the trough and looked around the ranch while she did it. Up close, the care she'd noticed from the road was even more apparent. The barn doors hung straight, the corrals were clean. There was a wooden bench outside the kitchen door with a pair of muddy boots sitting beside it, toes pointing out, like someone had stepped out of them in a hurry and left them there to dry. The kitchen garden had been put to bed for the season. She could see the mulched rows, the tied-up stalks, the evidence of a deliberate hand. She knew almost nothing about ranching, but she knew what it looked like when someone took their work seriously. She went back to the fence line. "I'm Evelyn Caro," she said. "I'm new to the valley." He set the mallet down and straightened. "Jonah Hale," he said. He looked at her for a moment with that same direct, undemanding gaze. "You riding through or staying?" "Staying. I'm looking for bookkeeping work. I have a letter of introduction from a freight operator in Pueblo." He nodded once, as if this information was neither surprising nor particularly interesting. "You might try Alderman Freight," he said. "Cal Alderman. His office is at the north end of Main Street. He's been running numbers himself for the past 8 months since his bookkeeper left for Denver. The numbers are not going well." She almost smiled. "How do you know how his numbers are going?" "Because he complains about it every Saturday at the feed store." Jonah said, without any particular expression. Loudly. She did smile then. Well, she said, that's useful to know. He picked up his mallet again. Thank you for the water, she said. Welcome, he said, and went back to his post. She rode back to the road and turned toward town, and she thought about the flowers on the hillside, and the fact that he'd said growing as if that were both the simplest and the most complete explanation possible. And she thought about the bench with the boots, and the straight-hung barn doors, and the kitchen garden put to bed with care. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, not the way most men looked at a woman alone on a road, measuring something, calculating something, but just straightforwardly, as if she were simply a person and he were simply a person. And the fact of her being a woman on a road alone was not a puzzle he needed to solve. By the time she reached town, she'd thought about it more than she should have. She told herself it was just because she was tired. Eek. Cimarron Valley's main street was 2 blocks long and aspiring toward a third. There was a general store, a hardware supplier, a small hotel with a dining room attached, a barbershop that appeared to also function as a dentist's office, if the sign in the window was to be believed, a lawyer's office, a post office that shared space with a notion shop, and at the north end, as Jonah Hale had said, the long, somewhat battered building with Alderman Freight and Supply painted on the side in letters that had once been red and were fading toward pink. Evelyn tied her horse in front of the hotel, got a room, $2 for the week, which was steep but necessary, went upstairs, washed her face and hands in the basin, changed her shirt, and then walked to the freight office. The door was open. Inside, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s sat behind a desk that was covered in papers the way a flood covers a field, completely and without particular organization. He had a red face and a frustrated expression, and he was holding a piece of paper at arm's length as if he could make it make sense by getting it far enough away from him. "Mr. Alderman?" Evelyn said. He looked up. His expression was the expression of a man who has been interrupted at something he was already failing at. "Yeah?" "My name is Evelyn Caro. I'm a bookkeeper. I was told you might be looking for one." He looked at her for a moment. "Who told you that?" "Jonah Hale." Something shifted in his expression, said, not exactly skepticism, more like recalibration. "Hale sent you. He mentioned your situation. I have a letter of introduction from Francis Crenshaw at Crenshaw Freight in Pueblo. He's been in business 22 years. Alderman put the paper down, which she noticed he did with some relief. "Let me see it," he said. She gave him the letter. He read it slowly, moving his lips slightly over certain parts, then read it again. He looked up at her. "Crenshaw says you saved him $400 in a single quarter by finding a billing error," he said. "It wasn't one error," she said. "It was 11 small errors that had accumulated over 18 months because no one had reconciled the freight invoices against the actual deliveries. The error was systemic. Fixing it required restructuring the billing process." $400, he said again. "And change," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at the pile of papers on his desk. "I pay $12 a month," he said, 6 days a week. "I'd want to see the books first," she said, "before I can tell you if that's fair." He blinked. "You want to see the books before you decide if the pay is fair?" "I want to know what I'm walking into," she said. "If the books are in good order, $12 a month is reasonable. If they're not, if there's a significant amount of work needed to bring them current, I'd want to discuss terms." He stared at her for what felt like a long time. Then he laughed, a short, surprised sound. "All right," he said. "Come look at the damn books." She spent an hour with the books that afternoon. When she came up from the back room, she said, $16 a month, and I need 2 weeks to bring everything current before we can establish a regular workflow. He said 15. She said 16 and pointed out 3 specific errors she'd already found in the first pass, one of which had been costing him approximately $4 a month in overpayment to a supplier who had apparently been counting on the fact that no one was checking. He said $16 a month and started her on Monday. She walked back to the hotel, feeling, for the first time in 3 weeks, like the ground was solid under her feet. The first month was work. Alderman Freight operated 3 wagons on a regular circuit through Cimarron Valley and 2 neighboring valleys to the east, carrying supplies to the ranches and small settlements that were too far from any town to come in for their own goods. Cal Alderman was a capable man with wagons and drivers and routes, and had almost no aptitude whatsoever for the financial architecture that held those operations together. His books were not maliciously wrong. He wasn't a dishonest man. They were just the books of someone who had learned what he'd needed to learn to get started and had never learned anything after that. Invoices were entered when he remembered to enter them. Payments were recorded in the wrong columns. Recurring expenses that should have been tracked against individual routes were lumped together in a single running account that told him almost nothing useful about which routes were profitable and which were bleeding money slowly. Evelyn worked through it the way she always worked through a new set of books. Systematically, without drama, going back to the primary sources, the invoices, the receipts, the delivery records, and rebuilding from there. She made a list of every discrepancy. She categorized them. She created a new ledger structure that separated the route accounts and built in a monthly reconciliation process so the mess couldn't accumulate again. After 2 weeks, she could tell Cal Alderman, with documentation, that his eastern route was profitable and his central route was breaking even, and his southern route was losing money because the delivery volume didn't justify the road wear on the equipment. Losing how much, he said. She showed him the numbers. He sat back in his chair. Hell, he said. The fix isn't complicated, she said. You either increase the volume on that route, which means finding 2 or 3 more customers in the southern settlements, or you negotiate better terms with the 2 largest accounts down there to offset the equipment costs, or you run the southern route with the lighter wagon on a reduced schedule. Any of those will bring it to break even or better within 6 months. He looked at her. Which would you do? She thought about it. The reduced schedule, she said. For now. Get it to break even first, then look at growing the volume. You don't want to be selling while you're still bleeding. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You ever think about running a freight company yourself? No, she said, which was true. You'd be better at it than me. I'm better at the numbers than you, she said. You're better at the wagons and the routes and knowing which roads hold up in the spring mud. Those things matter too. He seemed to find this answer satisfying in a way she hadn't quite expected. He nodded and looked at the ledger and then looked back at her and said, $16 was a steal, and I think you knew it when you asked. I knew it, she said. She paused. I needed the work. He nodded again, and they didn't discuss it further, and it was the most honest exchange she'd had with an employer in several years. She went back to Jonah Hale's ranch on a Sunday. Not immediately. It was 4 weeks before she went back, and she told herself it was because she wanted to tell him the lead about Alderman Freight had worked out, which was a reasonable thing to do. She also told herself, somewhat less convincingly, that she just happened to be riding that direction on her day off. She'd bought a horse of her own by then, a solid bay mare named Dora, who had a habit of stopping at water without being told, and otherwise did exactly what she was asked. She'd paid $42 for her, which had hurt, but the liveryman had given her a fair price, and she'd needed a horse she could count on. She came down the valley road and turned off toward the ranch, and Jonah was in the kitchen garden when she arrived, not tending it, but standing at the edge of it looking at something. He turned when he heard the horse. Miss Caro, he said. Mr. Hale. She dismounted. I wanted to tell you the tip about Alderman worked out. I heard, he said. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something close to it in his expression. Cal mentioned you'd rearranged his books considerably. His books needed rearranging. He said you found enough in the first afternoon to pay your own salary for the month. He's been telling people that? He's been telling everyone, Jonah said. Cal Alderman is not a quiet man when something goes right for him. She looked at the garden. What are you looking at? He turned back to it, trying to decide whether the garlic can stay in the ground another week, or if I need to pull it today. She looked at the rows of dark, slightly wilted green spikes emerging from the mulched soil. She knew almost nothing about garlic. What's the deciding factor? He said, how cold tonight gets. She looked at the sky, which was the kind of clear, pale blue that sometimes meant cold coming and sometimes didn't. Do you have a sense of that? Some, he said. Not enough. He paused, then said, have you eaten? It's close to noon. She hadn't expected the question. I don't want to trouble you, she said. It's soup, he said. It's on the stove already. No trouble. She tied Dora to the fence post and followed him inside. The inside of the house was what the outside had suggested: functional, unhurried, with nothing wasted, but also nothing missing. The kitchen had a good iron stove, a work table, shelves of preserves in neat rows, a wooden chair pulled close to the stove where a gray-muzzled dog was asleep on a folded blanket. The dog opened one eye when they came in, decided Evelyn was acceptable, and went back to sleep. She noticed a shelf of books on the near wall, not a decorative shelf, but a working one, with the spines worn and some of the books standing at angles where they'd been pulled out and not quite reshelved. A surveyor's manual, a book on irrigation, 2 volumes of what appeared to be agricultural science, a battered copy of something she couldn't read the spine of. Jonah went to the stove and ladled soup into 2 bowls without ceremony. It was a good soup. She could tell that from across the room, from the way it smelled, something with dried beans and what remained of a fall vegetable harvest. They sat at the kitchen table, which was the kind of table that had been scrubbed so many times the grain stood up slightly from the wood. They ate. For a while neither of them said anything, which was not uncomfortable in the way silences usually were. It was more like the silence of 2 people who didn't feel the need to fill space with noise. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said. He looked up from his bowl. "You can ask." "The flowers on this hillside. How long have you been growing them?" He was quiet for a moment, as if the question required genuine thought rather than a simple retrieval. 7 years, he said. "Started the first spring I was here. The soil up there, it's not good for much. Too much rock, not enough water. I thought about trying to clear it for pasture and then thought why." He paused. "I had some seed packets from a woman back in Missouri who'd sent them with me when I left. She said something was going to grow wherever I landed, and it might as well be something worth looking at." Evelyn set her spoon down. "Your mother?" "Aunt," he said. "She raised me after my parents were gone." He said it plainly, without asking for anything from it. "She died 2 years ago. The flowers—" He stopped, started again. "They do well up there, actually, the poor soil and the drainage. Turns out some things grow better in hard ground." Evelyn looked at her soup. She thought about her father's store and Theo Marsh's gold watch chain and the road out of Pueblo before sunrise, and she didn't say any of that. What she said was, "The woman who told me about Cimarron Valley, she was in a boarding house in Pueblo, and I'd never met her before. I was there one night waiting for the road to clear after a storm, and she just started talking. I almost didn't listen." "What made you listen?" "She had a specific quality," Evelyn said. "Some people know things, and some people are just talking. She knew things." She paused. She described the valley. She said it was dry and not particularly welcoming, but that things got built there, that the people who stayed were the kind of people who stayed. "That's accurate enough," Jonah said. "She didn't mention the flowers." He almost smiled. "Most people don't." The dog by the stove shifted and groaned in its sleep. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods by the creek with a dry, papery sound. Evelyn looked at the shelf of books and thought about the irrigation manual and the agricultural science volumes, and thought about a man who planted flowers on a hillside because the soil was too hard for anything else, and because his aunt had once sent seeds. "What's the dog's name?" she said. "Post," he said. "Post?" "I found him tangled in a fence post," Jonah said. "He'd been there a while. When I got him loose, I thought he might not make it, but he did." He paused. "He's 11 now. Doesn't do much." "He doesn't have to," Evelyn said. Jonah looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "He doesn't." She rode back to town in the early afternoon with the cold starting to come in from the north the way Jonah had been measuring it. She thought about soup and the dog named Post and the irrigation manual and the seeds his aunt had sent. She thought about the particular quality of the silence at that kitchen table, which had been nothing like the silences she'd known in offices and boarding houses and the various rooms she'd occupied in other people's buildings. It had felt like a silence that was on her side. She was halfway to town when she realized she'd left without telling him she'd likely come back next Sunday, and she decided she didn't need to tell him. He seemed like the kind of man who would understand that some things were just going to happen without needing to be announced. The cold settled in that night, hard and sudden. In the morning she heard from Cal Alderman, who'd heard from someone else, that Jonah Hale had pulled his garlic in the dark after she left and gotten it all in before the freeze hit the valley floor just after midnight. She noted this in no particular place and for no particular reason, and went back to the freight ledgers, where a discrepancy in the November supply invoices was waiting for her with the particular patience that problems had when they knew you were going to have to deal with them eventually. She found it in 20 minutes. She fixed it. She put a notation in the margin and moved on. Outside, the valley was cold and bright, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone silver with frost. Somewhere up on the hillside above Jonah Hale's ranch, the wildflowers were finished for the season, the stalks bent and brown, waiting in their hard ground for whatever came next. Winter settled into Cimarron Valley the way it settled into most high desert places. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door being shut. One morning the frost was just on the grass, and by the following week it was in the ground itself, and the creek ran slow and dark between its frozen edges. And the ranchers who'd put off fence repairs in the fall were out in the cold paying for that decision. Evelyn paid for her room through December, and then, because $12 of her 16 went to room and board at the hotel, and that arithmetic was unsustainable, she made an arrangement with a widow named Clara Foss, who had a spare room and a practical nature and charged $7 a month, including breakfast. The room was smaller than the hotel room, and the mattress had a particular geography to it that she was still mapping in February, but it had a south-facing window and good light in the mornings, and Clara Foss did not ask personal questions, which Evelyn appreciated more than she could adequately express. She had been at Alderman Freight for 3 months by then, and the books were in order in the way that a room is in order after you've actually cleaned it rather than just moved things from the floor to the furniture. Cal had taken her advice on the southern route, reduced schedule, lighter wagon, and the bleeding had stopped. He'd also, somewhat to her surprise, taken her suggestion about approaching the Hendricks Ranch and the Obar settlement with a proposal for consolidated deliveries, which cut his road time and gave both customers a modest discount in exchange for flexibility on delivery days. It had worked well enough that he was already thinking about applying the same logic to the eastern route. "You should have been doing this for 10 years, he told her one afternoon in January, looking at the quarterly summary she'd laid out for him. "I've been doing it for 10 years, she said, for other people." He looked up from the paper. He seemed to understand from her tone that there was something in that sentence he shouldn't pull on. "Well," he said, "you're doing it here now." "I am," she said, and went back to the invoices. She was good at the work. She'd always been good at it, which had been, she sometimes thought, both her advantage and her particular difficulty, because being good at something in a world that wasn't fully decided on whether you were allowed to do it meant you spent a significant portion of your energy on the permission problem rather than the work itself. She'd spent years being careful not to know too much in a room full of men who were supposed to know more, careful not to correct too directly, not to push too hard, not to make anyone feel the thing they'd feel when a woman understood something faster than they did. She was still careful at Alderman Freight, but less than she'd been elsewhere, because Cal Alderman was the particular kind of uncomplicated man who cared primarily about results and only secondarily about nearly everything else. The other men in the valley were a mixed accounting. The ranchers and suppliers and the 2 land lawyers who came through the valley on circuit, most of them were fine, or at least neutral, which in Evelyn's experience was the best you could reasonably expect. They dealt with her because Cal dealt with her, and Cal's endorsement carried weight because Cal was a known quantity in the valley, and his freight business was something most of them depended on in some form. A few of them were openly skeptical in the early months. She could feel it in the way they'd address Cal directly, even when she was the one who'd asked the question, or the way they'd repeat a number back to her slowly as if she might have heard it wrong the first time. She dealt with it by being precise and patient and right, consistently and without making a production of it, which was the only strategy she'd found that actually worked. There was one man, Vance Hollowell, who ran a cattle operation on the south end of the valley and had more land than most and the attitude that often accompanied it, who was less subtle about his skepticism than the others. He came into the freight office in late January to dispute an invoice for a supply delivery, and when Evelyn explained with documentation that the invoice was accurate and the discrepancy was in his own receiving records, he'd looked at her with the particular expression of a man who finds an argument less convincing the better it is and said, "I'd like to speak with Cal about this." "Cal is at the livery," she said. "He'll be back by 3. In the meantime, the documentation is here and the numbers are what they are." "I'll wait," he said, and sat in the chair by the door with his hat on his knee and his jaw set. And when Cal came back at 2:30, Evelyn handed him the file and said quietly, "Mr. Hollowell has a concern about the November invoice," and went back to her desk. She heard Cal go through the same explanation she'd given, using almost the same words, and heard Hollowell say, "Well, if that's how it is," and leave without another word. Cal came to her desk afterward and set the file down. "He knew you were right before I said a word," Cal said. "I know," she said. "Some men are just built that way." "I know that too," she said. Cal looked at her for a moment. He was not a particularly perceptive man about most things, but he had occasional moments of clarity that surprised her. "Does it get tiresome?" he said. She thought about Theo Marsh and his gold watch chain and the particular exhaustion of being told, in various ways, that the space you were competent in wasn't fully yours. "Yes," she said. "It does." He nodded. He didn't offer anything beyond that, which was fine. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be said true. She went to the Hale Ranch most Sundays through the winter. It had become a thing she did without much discussion of whether it was a thing she did. The first few times she'd still had reasons. She wanted to ask Jonah about a land dispute that had come up in the freight records, and he seemed to know the valley's history, or she was riding out that direction anyway, and it was just sensible to stop. By February, she had stopped inventing reasons. She rode out on Sunday mornings, tied Dora to the fence post, and found Jonah wherever he was, in the barn, or working on equipment in the yard, or once doing something she couldn't immediately identify to the stone foundation of the house, until she got closer and saw he was repointing the mortar between the rocks with a careful, slow hand. "Is that falling apart?" she said. "Not yet," he said. "Easier to fix before it is." She'd thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Their conversations had a quality she couldn't quite categorize and had eventually stopped trying to. They were not the conversations she had at work, which were purposeful and tracked toward outcomes. They were not the conversations she had with Clara Foss over breakfast, which were pleasant and surface and mainly about the weather and the doings of the town. They were something else, moving between practical and personal without particular ceremony, the way two people move around a shared kitchen when they know each other's habits well enough not to need to announce themselves. He told her about the valley's land history, who had come first and who had followed, and which of the original grants were still in dispute, and which parcels had changed hands under circumstances that didn't bear close examination. He knew this history not in the way a lawyer knew it, as a set of documents, but in the way a man knew it who had been in the valley for 7 years and paid attention and had good neighbors who talked. Evelyn listened and took notes in her head, filing things away against the freight records where they sometimes had bearing, a disputed property line showing up as a delivery access issue, a contested water right appearing as a reliability problem on one of the eastern routes. She told him about Pueblo selectively, about the freight company and the feed supplier and the 2 land offices and Theo Marsh, whom she described only as the last man I worked for in Pueblo, and from the way Jonah's jaw set slightly when she gave the bare outline of leaving, she understood that he'd heard the thing she hadn't said and filed it away the same way she filed things, carefully, without requiring her to explain it further. "What made you go to Pueblo in the first place?" he asked one Sunday in February, when they were sitting on the wooden bench outside the kitchen door with coffee going cold in their hands, watching Post make his arthritic way across the yard toward the barn for no particular reason. "My father moved us there when I was 22, she said. "He had an idea about a business." She paused. Most of his ideas about businesses didn't work out the way he planned them. He was a man who was better at starting things than continuing them. "And your mother?" "She died when I was 16. She said it the way Jonah had said my parents were gone, plainly, without asking for anything from it. She was the practical one. After she was gone, my father's ideas got bigger and the follow-through got smaller. I started keeping books to keep track of what we actually had." Jonah was quiet for a moment. "How old were you when you started doing that?" 17. He looked at his coffee. "That's a lot to pick up at 17. "I was good at it," she said without either pride or apology. "Numbers were easier to manage than most other things." "Most other things being what?" She looked across the yard where Post had stopped halfway to the barn, apparently having forgotten why he was going there, and was now standing in the cold sunlight looking at nothing with the serene vacancy of a very old dog. "People's decisions," she said. "Numbers are what they are. People decide to be something different every other day." Jonah made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "That's fair," he said. Post gave up on the barn and turned around and came back to the step. Jonah reached down without looking and scratched behind the dog's ear, and Post leaned into it with the full weight of his elderly body, eyes closing. The cold light lay across the yard, and the flower stalks on the hillside stood brown and patient in the frozen ground, and Evelyn sat on the bench with cold coffee and thought about nothing in particular, which was, she realized, a thing she hadn't done in a very long time. Spring came in March, grudgingly, with mud and then a late snow and then finally in April, actual warmth. The freight business expanded with it. Cal had been right that the valley was growing. New ranches, a small sawmill operation up in the eastern drainage, 2 new families settling on land that had been vacant for years. The route volumes went up, and the inventory of what people needed changed with the season, shifting away from the preserved goods and fuel that got people through winter and toward the lumber and fence wire and seed and equipment that came with spring building. Evelyn adjusted the route accounts and built new pricing structures for the expanded service and managed the hiring of a 4th driver, a taciturn man named Ed Rourke, who was reliable and almost completely silent, which she considered an asset in a driver. There was also a land conflict sharpening at the valley's edges that she'd been tracking in the freight records for months, and that was becoming difficult to ignore. It had started, as these things often did, with water. The creek that ran through Cimarron Valley fed off a spring higher in the mountains, and the rights to that water had been established in a series of grants and subsequent deeds that were not, she'd come to understand, entirely consistent with each other. 3 families in the northern end of the valley had paper that gave them access to the upper creek for irrigation. One large landowner, a man named Garfield Prue, who had arrived in the valley 2 years ago with money from somewhere east and had been buying up adjacent parcels since, had paper that appeared to overlap with all 3 of those grants in ways that his lawyer argued superseded the original rights. The dispute had been theoretically in front of the circuit court for 8 months. In practice, it was being settled the way disputes were actually settled in frontier valleys, which was through the gradual application of pressure. Fences moved incrementally, access roads blocked by equipment that happened to break down in inconvenient places. Supply deliveries becoming mysteriously unreliable for ranches that had sided against Prue in the courthouse. That last part was where the freight records were useful. Evelyn had noticed it in January. A pattern of late deliveries and missed runs to 3 specific ranches that happened to be the same 3 ranches with water rights in conflict with Prue. She hadn't said anything about it then because she wasn't certain. By April, she was certain. The pattern was consistent and the timing was not accidental. Someone was interfering with the delivery schedule on those routes, and when she traced it back through the records, it stopped at a driver who had since left Cal's employ and who had, as far as she could determine, briefly worked for Prue before coming to Alderman Freight. She brought it to Cal on a Wednesday afternoon with the documentation laid out in a single page. He looked at it for a long time. "You're sure about this?" he said. "I'm sure about the pattern," she said. "I can't prove intent from these records, but the pattern is there, and the timeline is what it is." Cal rubbed the back of his neck. "Prue is not a man who takes well to being accused of things." "I'm not accusing him of anything," she said. "I'm showing you what the records show. What you do with it is your decision." He was quiet. She could see him working through it. The business exposure if Prue decided to make trouble, the moral weight of doing nothing, the practical question of what doing something even meant in this context. Cal Alderman was not a brave man in the dramatic sense, but he was a fair one, and fairness, she'd found, was sometimes harder to maintain than courage. "I'll take it to the Calhoun family," he said finally, meaning one of the ranches whose access had been intercepted. "Give them a copy. Let them decide if they want to bring it to the land lawyer." "That seems right," she said. "And I'll make sure our routes to those 3 ranches are running exactly on schedule from here on," he said. He paused. "Personal guarantee." She looked at him. "That could cost you business from Prue." "Prue uses one of my wagons twice a year," Cal said. "The Calhouns use me every month." He picked up the paper and looked at it again. "Besides," he said, I don't much like being someone's tool without being told about it. She didn't say anything to that. She just gathered her copies and went back to her desk and thought that some men were, in fact, exactly as straightforward as they appeared to be, and that this was rarer than it should have been. She told Jonah about it the following Sunday. He was in the barn when she arrived, replacing a cracked board on one of the stall walls, and she leaned against the stall door and talked while he worked. He listened in the way he listened to most things, with his full attention and without interrupting. And when she finished, he set the board against the wall and said, "Prue's been moving on the Calhoun water for a year." "You knew about it?" "Most people with water rights in this valley know about it," he said. He picked up a nail and set it against the board. "The question's always been whether there's anything to do about it that doesn't cost more than the water's worth." "The freight records might give the Calhoun something to work with in court," she said. He drove the nail. "It might." He paused. "Or Prue's lawyer argues the delivery pattern was logistics and not interference, and the court takes another year to decide." He set another nail. "Courts in this territory take a long time to decide things they're not sure about." "What would you do?" she asked. He stopped. He looked at the board, not at her, for a moment. "I'd do what you did," he said. "Document it. Give the information to the people it helps. Make it harder for Prue to keep pretending he's just a neighbor with different paperwork." He drove the second nail. "Doesn't fix it, but it makes the truth harder to bury." She looked at the barn wall, at the careful way he was setting the boards, the way each nail went in straight and deliberate. "Do you have water rights in dispute?" she said. "Not currently," he said. "I'm far enough south on the creek that Prue's claim doesn't reach me. Yet." The yet sat in the air between them for a moment. "I've been thinking about buying the acre parcel," he said. It was the first time she'd heard him mention it, though the acre parcel had come up in the freight records, a piece of land on the eastern edge of his property that had been vacant since an original homesteader had given up on it 3 winters ago. "It would give me better creek access and room for more pasture." "Is it in dispute?" "Not yet," he said again. He picked up the last board and measured it against the wall. "I'd like to get the deed clear before it becomes one." She thought about the land lawyer who came through on circuit, a careful man named Aldous Verner who charged reasonable fees and seemed to actually understand the grant history in a way that some of the other lawyers she'd encountered in the territory did not. "Werner will be in the valley the 3rd week of May," she said. "He's handling the alderman contracts. I could ask him if he has time." Jonah looked at her. It was the particular look he sometimes gave her when she'd done something useful without being asked to. Not surprised exactly, but attentive to it in a way she was coming to understand was its own kind of acknowledgement. "I'd appreciate that," he said. She nodded. He went back to the board. The barn was warm with the smell of hay and horses and the particular dusty, dry smell of old wood in the afternoon. And outside the April light was long and pale gold across the valley floor, and the hillside above them was beginning, she'd noticed it on the ride in, to show the first small bright points of green where the flower stalks were putting out new growth. She stayed for supper that evening, the first time she'd stayed past the early afternoon, and they ate fried potatoes and salt pork at the kitchen table while Post slept by the stove with the total commitment of an animal that had no remaining ambivalence about anything. The conversation moved without agenda. The acre parcel, the new sawmill, a problem with one of Jonah's pasture gates that had warped over the winter and no longer closed properly, a book she'd read from Clara Foss's small shelf that had surprised her with how good it was. It was dark by the time she rode back to town, later than she'd intended, the valley cold and clear under a half moon with the creek glinting in the distance and the lights of the town coming up slow through the scrub. She was not a woman who let herself think about things before she was ready to think about them, but she was beginning to understand that something was taking shape in her life here in Cimarron Valley that she hadn't planned for and wasn't yet sure what to do about. Not the work. The work was clear and satisfying and hers in a way it had never quite been before. But the other thing, the Sunday thing. She was ready to admit, at least to herself, on the dark road back to town, that she looked forward to Sundays in a way she looked forward to almost nothing else in the week. She was not, however, quite ready to do anything about that knowledge yet. She filed it carefully, the way she filed things she wasn't ready to act on but needed to keep accurate track of, and rode the rest of the way home in the dark. Werner came through the valley the 3rd week of May as scheduled, and Evelyn made the introduction between him and Jonah on a Tuesday afternoon in the freight office, which was the most neutral ground she had available. Werner was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular quality of stillness that some lawyers developed after years of listening to people explain their problems. He took in information without reacting to it, which Evelyn had learned to read as competence rather than indifference. He looked at the documents Jonah had brought, asked 4 specific questions, and said he believed the Acker parcel could be acquired with a clean deed if the filing was done correctly and promptly, before Prue's lawyer found reason to cloud the title. "How promptly?" Jonah said. 2 weeks, Werner said. "I can file the claim before I leave the valley. You'd need to have the purchase price settled with the Acker estate by Friday." Jonah looked at the papers. Evelyn knew, from things he'd mentioned without making a point of them, that the purchase would take most of what he'd saved through the winter. She also knew he wouldn't say that in front of Werner because he was not a man who explained his financial situation to people he'd just met. "Friday is fine," Jonah said. Werner nodded and made a note, and that was the end of it. Afterward, when Werner had gone, Jonah stood in the freight office doorway for a moment looking at the street. "Thank you," he said. "Werner does good work," she said. "The Calhoun family used him last fall." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I meant, thank you for thinking of it." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the ledger open on her desk, because looking at him for too long had lately developed the quality of looking directly at something bright, not unpleasant, but requiring some adjustment. "It made sense," she said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. And she thought from the way he didn't say anything further that he understood both parts of that. He left, and she went back to the freight invoices and tried to think about the invoices. The valley's social life centered, as it did in most small western towns, on a rotating schedule of practical and semi-practical gatherings. The feed store on Saturdays, the church on Sundays for those who attended, a monthly town meeting that handled everything from road maintenance to water allocation disputes, and twice a year a community dance held in the larger of the 2 buildings the valley's informal civic association had ever managed to construct. The spring dance was in late May, 2 weeks after Werner filed the Acker deed claim, and was the kind of event that everyone in the valley attended. Not necessarily because they wanted to, but because not attending sent a message you generally didn't want to send in a community where you depended on your neighbors for a significant portion of your practical survival. Evelyn had been to the fall dance, which had been her first month in the valley, and had spent most of it with Clara Foss and Cal Alderman's wife, a pleasant woman named Marta, and had danced twice with Ed Rourke, who turned out to be unexpectedly capable on a dance floor for a man who communicated entirely in single syllables. Jonah had been there briefly, and they had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes near the refreshment table before he'd gone home, which she had later understood was characteristic. He attended these things because not attending sent a message, but he tended to leave early. The spring dance was different, though she couldn't have said precisely why until later. It was held on a Friday evening in the last week of May, and the weather had cooperated. Warm enough that the big double doors of the building stood open and people spilled out onto the plank steps and the yard, and the fiddle music moved out into the evening air and mixed with the sound of the creek and the first full-throated frogs of the season. Evelyn wore the better of her 2 good dresses, a dark blue wool that was more suited to October than May, but was the best she had, and arrived with Clara Foss and immediately ran into Marta Alderman, who pulled her into a conversation about the hardware supplier's price increases that was, despite sounding tedious, actually quite interesting because Marta Alderman was sharper about money than her husband, and knew it, and was largely unbothered by the fact that he didn't. She had been there perhaps an hour, had danced once with a rancher named Tilson, who was a widower in his 60s and an excellent dancer, and who had the good manners to make no conversation during a song, when she became aware of a situation developing near the far side of the room. Vance Hollowell was there. He was usually at these events because Hollowell was a man who liked to be seen and liked to be the kind of presence in a room that other people arranged themselves around. He had a cluster of men near him, 2 of his own ranch hands, and a third man Evelyn recognized as a buyer from one of the eastern suppliers who came through the valley seasonally. They were talking in the way men talked at dances when they were primarily interested in performing for each other, rather than actually conversing, voices a half-pitch too loud, a little more edge to the laughter than the jokes warranted. Evelyn noticed this and then deliberately stopped noticing it, because Hollowell was not her concern, and she had a glass of lemonade in a perfectly good spot near the wall. Then she heard her name. Not directly. Hollowell wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the buyer from the Eastern supplier, and she caught it because the room had a particular acoustic quality, and she'd spent enough years paying attention in rooms where she was being discussed to develop a sensitivity to it. Cal Alderman's bookkeeper, she heard, and then something she didn't fully catch, and then clearly, can't imagine what Cal's thinking, trusting figures from a woman who's never run a business in her life. The buyer said something she didn't catch. Numbers are one thing, Hollowell said, but understanding what those numbers mean for an operation, that takes experience. Real experience. Not just adding up columns. She set her lemonade glass down on the table beside her. She was aware, with the clarity that came from years of practice, of the specific calculation that happened in these moments. The calculation between what you wanted to do and what it would cost you to do it. The measurement of how much the thing was worth against how much damage the response might cause. She'd spent 10 years making that calculation and mostly landing on the side of saying nothing, because saying nothing was usually the rational choice, and she was, above most things, a rational person. She was also, she had been coming to understand in Cimarron Valley, increasingly tired of the rational choice. She had just decided, somewhat against her own better judgment, that she was going to walk across the room and say something direct and probably inadvisable, when Jonah Hale appeared at Hollowell's elbow. She hadn't seen him come in. He was there suddenly, the way he was sometimes suddenly just present in a conversation, and he looked at Hollowell with that level, gray-eyed directness that she had come to understand was his version of something quite pointed. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood there, which in itself seemed to reconfigure the shape of the conversation. Hollowell, he said. Hollowell turned. He was taller than Jonah by an inch, but something about the way Jonah stood made the height irrelevant. Hale, he said. His voice had shifted, slightly, but enough to notice. I heard you talking about the freight accounts, Jonah said. Just making conversation, Hollowell said. You mentioned Miss Caro's figures. Jonah said it flatly, without inflection. I've been in this valley 7 years. I've dealt with the freight accounts under 3 different bookkeepers. In 6 months, she straightened out discrepancies that went back 2 years and rebuilt the route accounts from the ground up. Cal's southern route was losing money for 18 months before she found it. He paused. I know this because Cal tells anyone who'll listen. The buyer had gone quiet. Hollowell's ranch hands were looking at their boots. No one's questioning her arithmetic, Hollowell said, which was a retreat dressed as a clarification. You questioned her understanding, Jonah said. That's different from arithmetic. He looked at Hollowell with the same steady, unhurried directness. The acre parcel I just acquired. The deed filing required someone who understood not just the property values, but the pattern of claims in this valley and which parcels were vulnerable to title disputes. Werner asked Miss Caro to review the chain of ownership before he filed because she had the freight records and knew the valley's land history better than most people who've been here longer. He stopped. He wasn't raising his voice. He hadn't moved closer to Hollowell. He was just saying things that were true, one after another, in a tone that left no obvious opening for argument. The deed is clean. Werner said it was one of the cleaner filings he'd done in 2 years. Hollowell looked at him for a long moment. There was something working in his face, not embarrassment exactly, more the expression of a man who has gotten used to having the last word and is recalculating whether this is a situation in which that's available to him. Just conversation, Hale, he said again. And then, because there was nothing else useful to do, he turned back to his group and the conversation moved to something else. Jonah stepped away from them. He crossed the room without hurrying, got himself a glass of water from the table, and came to stand near Evelyn, who had watched all of this from her spot by the wall with her hands folded in front of her and an expression she had specifically composed to show nothing. For a moment, neither of them said anything. I was about to walk over there myself, she said. I know, he said. I saw you put the glass down. I had something to say. You did, he agreed. He drank his water. It would have cost you more than it cost me. She looked at him. He was watching the room, not her, which gave her a moment to look at the line of his jaw and the way he stood, not tense, just solid, and the thing she'd been keeping filed carefully in the back of her mind for several months made itself considerably harder to ignore. Is what you said true? She said. About Werner asking me to review the chain of ownership. He glanced at her. I suggested it to Werner, he said. He agreed it was sensible. That's functionally the same thing. That's not exactly the same as him asking me. No, he said, but it's not false either. He paused. The deed is clean. She was quiet for a moment. Why did you tell him that? She said. About the deed. He looked at the room again. Because it was true and because he needed to hear something he couldn't argue with. He turned the glass in his hand. He doesn't believe you're competent because that's more convenient for him than believing it. Facts don't fix that, but they make it harder to say out loud. She thought about this, about the years of calculation, the careful choosing of the rational option, the specific exhaustion of being good at something in rooms that found your presence in those rooms inconvenient. She thought about Jonah's face when Hollowell had gone quiet, the complete absence of heat in it, the way he'd simply placed truth in front of a man who'd been avoiding it. He didn't fight it, she said. No, Jonah said. He won't. Men like Hollowell don't actually want to fight. They want an audience. He set his empty glass down. Take away the audience and the whole thing collapses. The fiddle started up again across the room, something faster than the last song, and the dancers reorganized themselves. Clara Foss caught Evelyn's eye from across the room with an expression that asked several questions without words. Evelyn gave her a look that answered none of them. Dance with me, she said. It came out more directly than she'd planned, which was slightly embarrassing, but she'd said it, and it was out, and she didn't take things back. Jonah looked at her. His expression was the one she'd learned to read as something between consideration and a thing he was trying to keep neutral. I'm not a good dancer, he said. I'm not asking for good, she said. I'm asking for willing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, All right. They danced. He was right that he wasn't particularly good at it. He was a little stiff in the shoulders, and he counted under his breath at one point when the tempo changed, which she found unexpectedly endearing rather than annoying. She was a decent dancer, which meant she could work around his counting. They managed it without stepping on each other more than once, which she considered successful by any reasonable standard. When the song ended, they stepped apart. The room was warm and loud and smelled of people and the last of the spring evening coming in through the open doors, and Evelyn was aware of a particular lightness in her chest that she recognized, having felt it before in her life on a handful of occasions, as something she would have to be careful with. That wasn't as bad as advertised, she said. He almost smiled. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, she said. I'm always accurate. He looked at her for a moment with that steady attention that had an effect she was no longer pretending not to notice. I know, he said. That's one of the things about you. She wanted to ask what the other things were, which was precisely the kind of question she was not ready to ask yet. So instead she said, I think Clara Foss is trying to get my attention, which was true, and excused herself, and spent the next 20 minutes talking to Clara Foss about something she could not afterward recall at all. She rode out to the ranch the following Sunday and found Jonah mending a section of fence along the north pasture, which meant she stood on one side of the fence and he worked on the other, and they talked across it, which felt, she thought, like an accurate description of where they'd been for 6 months, close enough to hand things back and forth, but still on separate sides of something. I've been thinking about what you said at the dance, she said. About Hollowell. He wound a section of wire without looking up. What about it? You said men like him don't want to fight. They want an audience. She paused. That's true. But you also knew exactly what to say, the specific things. The deed, Werner, the southern route. She watched him work. You'd been paying attention. He glanced up at that. I've been paying attention too, she said. The words were deliberate. She'd composed them on the ride out, which was unlike her. She was not usually a person who scripted conversations, but this one felt like it required precision. I've been paying attention for 6 months, and I think you have too. And I think we're both quite good at filing things away and waiting until we're sure, and I'm telling you now that I'm sure. He'd stopped working. The north pasture was quiet around them, a meadowlark calling somewhere out in the grass, the fence wire warm in the morning sun. Post was asleep under the wagon nearby, legs twitching in whatever elderly dogs dreamed about. Jonah set the pliers down on the fence post and looked at her directly, which was what he always did when something was real, No avoidance, no deflection, just that clear gray attention. "What are you sure of?" he said. She looked back at him. "That I want to stop pretending Sunday is just a habit," she said. "That I come out here because I want to, not because of a reason I invented. That the last 6 months have been—" She stopped. She was not usually at a loss for how to complete a sentence, and the fact that she was now was either a bad sign or a meaningful one, and she'd decided it was the second thing. "Different," she said finally, "in a way that matters." He was quiet for long enough that she was aware of the meadowlark and the creek sound and the specific quality of her own heartbeat. "I've been waiting to see if it would change," he said. "What I thought." He picked up the pliers again, not to use them, just something to do with his hands. "It didn't change." "Is that a yes?" she said, because she was, above all things, precise. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the thing that came just before one. "Yes," he said. She let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. "Good," she said. "That's good." He looked at her across the fence. "Are you going to come around to this side?" he said. She looked at the fence. She looked at him. "I was waiting to be asked," she said. "I'm asking," he said. She came around through the gate at the end of the fence line, which was perhaps 20 feet away, and took a reasonable amount of time to walk. And by the time she got there, she was fairly sure her face was doing something she normally kept better control of, but she decided that was acceptable under the circumstances. He was standing where she'd left him, and when she reached him, he didn't reach for her immediately, just looked at her with that same attention, as if he was still making sure of something. She was the one who closed the remaining distance. It was not a dramatic moment, or not dramatic in the way she'd sometimes imagined such moments might be. There was no particular rush of wind or notable quality of light, just the morning and the fence and post snoring faintly under the wagon, and the awkward, genuine, slightly fumbled reality of two people who were not young and not careless finding their way to each other across the last few inches of a 6-month distance. His hands were rough from the fence wire, and her hat got knocked crooked, and neither of them said anything for a while after. When she stepped back, she straightened her hat and looked at him, and he looked back at her. And for once, neither of them reached for something to say to fill the space, because the space didn't need filling. "I should finish this fence," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "I'll get the other pliers from the barn." He looked at her. "You know how to mend fence?" "No," she said, "but I know how to hand someone a tool, and you can explain the rest." He did almost smile then. "All right," he said. She got the pliers from the barn and came back and spent the next 2 hours learning, in a somewhat impractical way, the basics of fence repair in the high desert, which involved more wrestling with wire than she'd anticipated, and a cut on her left thumb from a barb that she refused to make a production of. Jonah showed her the technique twice without impatience and corrected her grip once and otherwise let her work it out, which was the way she preferred to learn things. Post eventually woke up and moved himself 3 feet to find a better patch of sunlight and went back to sleep. By noon, the fence line was done, and her thumb had stopped bleeding, and she had wire calluses on both palms, and something had fundamentally shifted in the specific geography of her life, though she could not yet see the full shape of it from where she was standing. That, she thought, was probably fine. She'd never needed to see the whole shape to start the work. She moved to the ranch in August. It was not a dramatic relocation. She had been spending enough time out there through June and July that the move was more acknowledgement than change. The mornings she'd spent riding in from Clara Foss's spare room were simply replaced with mornings she was already there, already at the kitchen table with the account book she'd started keeping for both the freight business and the ranch, already knowing where the coffee was and which burner on the stove ran hot, and how to prop the back door so it stayed open without banging in the afternoon wind. Clara Foss helped her carry the 2 trunks to the wagon without commentary, which was its own form of approval. She had a way of withholding comment on things she disapproved of and simply being present and practical about the things she didn't, and her silence on the subject of Evelyn moving to Jonah Hale's ranch was the silence of a woman who had watched the whole thing develop over 10 months and considered it entirely sensible. She pressed a jar of preserved plums into Evelyn's hands at the door and said, "You'll want to get a proper root cellar dug before fall," and that was the extent of the ceremony. The practical reality of 2 people combining a life was less seamless than the theory. Jonah had lived alone for 7 years, which meant the ranch ran entirely on his rhythms and his habits, and his particular tolerance for certain kinds of disorder that coexisted with his insistence on order in other things. He left tools wherever he'd last used them, not carelessly, but as if his memory of where he'd put something was reliable enough to substitute for putting it in a fixed place, which it often was, but not always. He ate supper early, earlier than she was accustomed to, and had trouble sleeping past 4:30 in the morning, which meant the house was active at an hour she considered genuinely uncivilized for the first several weeks. He had opinions about how to salt meat that were, she thought, incorrect, and he held them with the quiet conviction of a man who has been doing a thing alone long enough to have stopped questioning it. She, for her part, was not easy to live with either. She knew this. She had a precise relationship with her own systems, the way the ledgers were organized, the way the household accounts needed to be tracked, the order in which she needed to approach a morning before she was fit for conversation, and when those systems were disrupted by someone else's well-intentioned but differently organized approach to the same problems, she felt it as a specific internal friction that she was not always graceful about expressing. They had their first real argument in September over the ranch accounts. She had started keeping them in July, informally, because the situation had seemed to call for it. Jonah tracked his finances in a single ledger that was accurate in the way a tally is accurate, which is to say, it told you what came in and what went out, but not much about why or what the pattern meant. When she proposed restructuring it along the same lines as the freight accounts, route by route, category by category, month against year, he had said, "I've managed fine with what I have." "You've managed," she agreed, "but you don't know which part of the operation is actually profitable and which is surviving on the income from the other parts. I know the cattle account and I know the hay account." "You know the gross numbers," she said. "That's different from knowing the margins." He'd looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger exactly, more a kind of tightening, the look of a man who has been running his own operation for 7 years and has just been told, implicitly, that he hasn't been running it right. She recognized the expression because she'd caused it before in other men, and in those cases she'd backed off, because backing off was what the situation had required. She sat with the question of whether to back off now. "I'm not saying it's wrong," she said, adjusting her approach. "I'm saying a different system would give you information you don't currently have. You can decide whether that information is useful." "What information?" he said. She showed him. She'd already done the preliminary work on the back pages of her own notebook, pulled 3 years of his numbers from the old ledger and restructured them the way she meant to. She laid it in front of him and let him look at it, and she watched his face move through the stages of reading something that told you something you hadn't known. After a while he said, "The hay sales are the margin." "Yes," she said, "not the cattle. The cattle break even in a good year," she said. "The hay is what gives you room, which means if you could expand the hay production, the acre parcel would support it. You'd have more flexibility to absorb a bad cattle year without it cutting into the operation." He looked at the numbers for another long moment. She could see him working it through. Not just the arithmetic, but the implications, the decisions it might open up or close off. He had the same quality she'd noticed in good freight operators. He could see a number and understand what it was attached to in the physical world, which was rarer than it sounded. "I should have done this 3 years ago," he said. Not to her exactly. More to the ledger. "You didn't have someone to do it," she said. "Now you do." He looked up at her. The tightening in his face had gone. "That's true," he said. He paused. "I'm sorry I pushed back on it." "You were right to push back," she said. "I came at it wrong." He frowned slightly. "How?" "I said you managed fine, but implied you hadn't," she said. "That's a bad way to start." He considered this with the same gravity he gave most things. "Yes," he said. "It is." He paused again. "You're right about the acre parcel." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. "You always know." "Not always," she said, "but often enough to be useful." They restructured the accounts together over the following 2 weeks, which was slower than it would have been if she'd done it alone, but resulted in something he actually understood from the inside rather than just accepted from the outside, and she thought that was probably worth the additional time. The news about the railroad came in October, carried in on the circuit lawyer's visit and confirmed by two separate letters Cal Alderman received from freight contacts in the Eastern Territory. A branch line was being surveyed through the region, not through Cimarron Valley itself, most likely, but close enough that it would reach a junction town 20 miles to the east within 2 to 3 years. The effect on a freight operation in the valley was not immediately obvious and depended entirely on which way you thought about it. Cal sat with Evelyn in the freight office on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Does this put me out of business?" She had already been thinking about this for the 3 days since she'd heard. "No," she said, "not if you adjust before it gets there." Adjust how? She laid it out for him the way she'd worked it through. The railroad wouldn't replace local freight. It would change where the goods entered the regional economy. Right now, Cal's wagons collected from distant suppliers and distributed through the valley. With a railroad junction 20 miles out, the supply end would change. Goods would arrive cheaper and faster at the junction, and the distribution challenge would shift. The operation that thrived wasn't the one that competed with the railroad on the long haul. It was the one that became indispensable for the last 20 miles. You'd be running a shorter circuit, she said. Junction to valley and back, less time on the road, more frequency, potentially better rates because your equipment wear goes down. Cal looked at the map she'd sketched on the back of an invoice. What about the ranches in the eastern drainage? They're using me for the long haul now. Some of them will shift to the junction directly, she said. You'll lose that revenue, but you'll gain efficiency on the routes you keep, and there are 3 or 4 ranches in the northern valley that would use daily service if you could offer it. Right now they consolidate orders because the turnaround is too slow. He was quiet for a moment. How long do I have? 2 years, maybe 3, she said. Enough time to make the changes gradually if you start thinking about them now. He looked at the map. He looked at her. You've been in this valley a year, he said. 11 months, she said. You know this operation better than I do. I know the numbers, she said. You know the roads. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I want you to know something. He said it with the slightly awkward directness of a man not accustomed to saying things that weren't about business. When you walked into this office 11 months ago with Crenshaw's letter and told me you wanted to see the books before you'd agree to the pay, I almost told you to go. I thought it was impertinence. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. I'd have been wrong, he said. You'd have been wrong, she agreed. She said it without heat, without needing to make a production of it. Just a fact, like the numbers on a ledger. He nodded once, the nod of a man closing an account. What would you do first, he said, if you were me? She turned back to the map and told him. Winter came again, and the ranch was different with 2 people in it. Jonah had started work on the acre parcel in the fall, clearing the worst of the brush, running a new fence line, testing the soil in the lower sections where she'd identified the best potential for expanding the hay production. It was slow work, fit around the regular ranch demands, and they'd agreed to pace it over 2 seasons rather than push too hard in the first year and run short on working capital. This was the kind of compromise they were getting better at, her natural inclination toward aggressive restructuring, meeting his more measured sense of what land required, what you couldn't rush and what you could. The flowers on the hillside had gone to seed in October, and Jonah had spent an afternoon collecting from them, which she'd watched without comment from the kitchen window while she worked on the freight accounts. He came in with his coat pockets full of seed envelopes, paper folded carefully around each variety, and set them on the shelf beside the agricultural science books. Are you going to expand them? She said. I was thinking about it, he said. He took his coat off and hung it on the hook by the door. The lower section of the acre parcel, the part that's too rocky for hay, might suit them. She looked at the window, at the darkening hillside beyond it. Your aunt sent enough seed for that? No, he said, but I've been collecting and replanting for 7 years. There's enough now. She thought about that. 7 years of a man methodically collecting seed from flowers that weren't practical, that served no commercial purpose, that grew in ground too poor for anything useful, doing it because someone who'd loved him had once thought beauty was worth carrying. Show me how, she said. In the spring. He turned from the coat hook and looked at her. You want to learn to plant them? I want to know how, she said. There's a difference. He understood the difference. All right, he said. February brought a problem she hadn't anticipated. It came in the form of a letter to Cal Alderman from a freight consolidation company based in Denver, a company called Harwick and Sons that had been expanding its network of regional freight operations in the territory and had apparently identified Alderman Freight as a target for acquisition. The letter was professionally written and offered a price for the business that was, on its face, generous. Cal brought it to Evelyn and set it on her desk with the expression of a man who has been handed something he doesn't know how to hold. She read it twice. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "That's why I'm asking you." "What do you know about Harwick?" "Nothing," he said. "You?" She'd heard the name. It had appeared in freight correspondence from Pueblo, and once in a letter from Crenshaw, mentioned in passing as a company expanding aggressively into regional routes. "They buy operations and run them from Denver," she said. "They standardize everything: routes, rates, drivers. The local operation becomes a branch office." "Would that be bad?" Cal said. She thought about how to answer this honestly. "For the valley, possibly," she said. "Harwick will run routes that are profitable and cut the ones that aren't. Some of the smaller ranches in the northern valley use routes that don't make money on volume but are important to the people on them. A Denver accountant cuts those. Your ranchers start having to come into town for their own supplies or find another way." Cal was quiet. "And for me?" he said. "The price is good," she said. "You'd be done with the risk, done with the management." She paused. "You'd also be done with the decisions." He looked at the letter. "You think I shouldn't sell?" "I think you should know what you're selling," she said, "not just the wagons and the routes, the relationships." She leaned back. "Calhoun family, the Obars, the Tilson Ranch. They use you because you're local and you're reliable, and if something goes wrong, you're 20 minutes away, not 4 days by telegraph from Denver." "Harwick would keep someone local," he said. "Harwick would keep someone cheaper than you," she said. "That's not the same thing." He sat with this for a while. She let him sit with it, because this was not a decision she could make for him and he needed to come to it on his own ground. The office was warm from the stove, snow ticking against the window in small dry flecks. "What would you need?" he said finally. "To help me write back a counter?" She looked at him. "You want a counter. I want to know what this business is worth to someone else," he said. "That's different from wanting to sell it." A pause. "And I want them to know it's not a distressed operation. I want them to know what they'd actually be buying." She picked up the letter again. "I'll need a week to put together the right documentation," she said. "Profit projections through the railroad transition, route valuations, customer stability metrics." "Do that," he said. "It'll cost you whether you sell or not," she said. "My time." He looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize as his version of exasperation, which was mild and almost fond. "Evelyn," he said, "I know what you're worth. That stopped being the question a long time ago." She took the letter and went to work. Jonah's response when she told him about it that evening was characteristically direct. They were at the kitchen table after supper, Post in his place by the stove. The ranch accounts opened between them because they'd been working on the spring planning before she'd mentioned the Harwick letter. "What do you think Cal will do?" he said. "I think he'll keep it," she said. "I think he wants someone to make it safe to keep it. The counter documentation will do that. It'll show him what the business actually is and show Harwick that he knows it." Jonah looked at the ranch accounts. "And if Harwick comes back with a better offer?" "Then Cal has a real decision," she said. "But it'll be his decision, made with the right information." She paused. "That's what I can do for him. I can't decide what he values." Jonah was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was moving across the valley floor, hitting the side of the house with a low, steady pressure. The stove knocked and settled. "What do you value?" he said. He said it without looking at her, which was how he sometimes said the things that mattered, looking at the table or the window or the thing in his hands, as if the question would be easier to answer if it didn't have his full attention aimed at it. She looked at him for a moment. The kitchen, the stove, the old dog, the accounts spread on the table with their columns of numbers that meant cattle and hay and seed and fence wire and a piece of land that had been too hard for anything until someone decided it wasn't. "This," she said. He looked up at her then. "This is what I value," she said. It wasn't an eloquent declaration. It was just a fact, said plain, the way she said most facts. She meant the ranch and the accounts and the freight business and the Sunday mornings and the arguments about ledger structure and the fence wire and the hours she'd sat at this table while snow moved across the window and felt, for the first time in a life that had been largely conducted in borrowed rooms, that she was somewhere that actually belonged to her. Jonah put his hand over hers on the table. His hand was rough and warm, and he didn't say anything because it was the kind of moment that didn't need words added to it. They sat there for a while. Outside, the February wind pushed across the valley, and the stove ticked and Post breathed in his slow, satisfied way. And the accounts stayed open on the table with the spring planning half finished, the numbers for the acre parcel expansion sitting in their column waiting for the ground to thaw. There was still a lot to do. There always was. But it was their work to do, on their land, in a life they'd been quietly, practically, imperfectly building together for the better part of a year. That was enough. More than enough. It was, she thought, exactly what it needed to be. Spring came that year with more rain than anyone in the valley had seen in a decade. It started in March. Not the usual thin scatter of late winter moisture, but actual sustained rain, day after day. The kind that turned the creek loud and brown and pushed the cottonwoods into leaf 3 weeks ahead of their usual schedule. The ranchers watched it with the particular mixture of relief and suspicion that farmers and cattlemen reserve for good weather, as if too much of a good thing was simply a different kind of problem waiting to introduce itself. The creek rose to the edge of its banks twice in April and then settled back, and by May the valley floor was greener than Evelyn had seen it since her arrival nearly 2.5 years before. The acre parcel had been broken in the previous fall. Jonah had run the new fence line across it in November, and through the winter he'd hauled composted material from the cattle yard to the lower sections where the soil was thinnest, working it in by hand in the patches he intended for hay, building the ground up slowly the way he'd learned to build things, not rushing toward a finished state, but attending to the conditions that made a finished state possible. When the rain came in March, it soaked into ground that was ready for it, and by April there were green shoots in the first test rows that were thick enough to make him stand at the fence line for 10 minutes without saying anything. Evelyn came up behind him and looked at the rows and said, "Well," he agreed, "that's going to be a good first cut. If the rain holds another 3 weeks," he turned from the fence, "and if it stops before the ground gets too wet to work." She'd learned by now that this was how he talked about good things, always with the conditional, always with the thing that could still go wrong placed alongside the thing that was going right. She'd initially found it frustrating, had read it as a failure to acknowledge success. She'd come to understand it differently. It wasn't pessimism. It was the habit of a man who had worked hard ground long enough to know that the ground wasn't on your side or against you. It was just what it was, and what it was could change. You kept both possibilities in front of you not because you expected the worst, but because you respected the uncertainty. She'd started doing it herself, without noticing, until Jonah pointed it out one evening. "You said, 'if the numbers hold,'" he'd told her. "You used to say, 'the numbers hold.'" She'd looked at him and said, "Is that a problem?" And he'd said, "No, I just noticed." And she'd understood that he meant it as something between an observation and a form of affection, and she'd gone back to her ledger with a feeling she still didn't have a fully adequate word for. The flower planting happened in the second week of May. She'd asked him to show her in the winter, and he'd remembered, which was the kind of thing she'd stopped being surprised by. Jonah didn't forget things that mattered to the people around him. He brought out the envelopes he'd been collecting and sorting all winter, laid them on the kitchen table one evening, and explained each variety with the specific knowledge of someone who had learned it through years of direct observation rather than from a book. This one needed poor drainage. This one came up in shade if you gave it enough time. This one spread on its own once established, and you needed to give it room or it would crowd the others out. "That one sounds like a management problem," she said. He looked up from the envelope. "It is," he said, "but it's also the one that blooms longest into fall. So you keep it, but you watch it. You keep it, and you watch it," he agreed. On the Saturday they planted, it was warm, but not hot. The kind of spring day that felt like a genuine gift after a long winter. They worked the rocky lower section of the acre parcel for 4 hours, Jonah showing her the planting depth and the spacing and which patches of soil indicated what the seeds would need. She did it badly at first, too deep, too close together, her spacing inconsistent. And he corrected her without impatience, the way he'd corrected her fence mending 2 years ago, trusting her to absorb it and do better, which she did. By early afternoon, they'd worked through half the envelopes, and her back ached, and her knees were dirty, and she sat back on her heels and looked at the turned ground and the small, careful markers they'd set for each section. "How long before anything shows?" she said. "Some of them, 6 weeks," he said. He was crouching at the far end of the row, tamping the last section with his palm. "Some of them, 2 years. The ones that come from deep root systems. They spend the first season establishing underground. You don't see anything, and you think nothing happened." She looked at the bare ground. "That would be frustrating." "It is," he said. "The first year I planted the hillside, half of it looked like failure all summer. Then the following spring, the sections I'd given up on came up thicker than anything else." She sat with that for a moment, thought about the specific patience required to tend something that gave you no visible evidence it was working. Thought about Jonah at 30 years old, new to this valley, driving fence posts alone and planting flowers in rocky ground because someone who'd loved him thought beauty was worth carrying. "Your aunt would have liked this," she said. He looked up from the end of the row. He looked at the ground they'd planted. "Yes," he said, "she would have." Bo. Cal Alderman's counter to Harwick and Sons had been met, as Evelyn had predicted, with a revised offer. The documentation she'd prepared, route valuations, customer stability metrics, the 3-year projection accounting for the railroad junction, had apparently impressed someone at the Denver office enough to take the operation more seriously than they'd initially priced it. The revised offer was 20% higher than the first. Cal brought it to her in June and sat across the desk with the particular expression of a man who has been thinking hard about something for a long time and has finally arrived at a conclusion that costs him something. "I'm going to tell them no," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me why." "Because what you showed me in that documentation." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know what I had. I didn't know what it was worth, not in money terms. You made me see it, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and once I couldn't unsee it, selling it felt like—" He looked for the word. "Waste," he said. "Not of the money, of the thing itself." "The railroad transition is still coming," she said. "That's going to require real changes." "I know." He looked at her. "Will you help me make them?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which meant she was quiet for long enough that he waited without trying to fill the space. She had been thinking for several months about what the next few years looked like. The freight accounts were in order, the ranch accounts were in order, the acre expansion was producing. She'd been useful, and she would keep being useful. But useful in the same way for the same reasons started, eventually, to feel like standing still. "I want to take on more of the operational decisions," she said. "Not just the numbers. The route structures, the contracts, the supplier negotiations." He blinked. "That's most of what I do." "I know." He was quiet. He was doing the same thing he'd done with the Harwick letter, working out what it meant, what he'd be giving up, what he'd be gaining. "You'd want more pay," he said. "Yes," she said. "How much more?" She told him. He didn't blink this time, which meant he'd already been thinking in that direction. "And you'd still keep the books?" he said. "I'd find someone to keep the books," she said. "Train them. Manage the accounts from oversight rather than detail." He looked at her for a long moment. "If you took over the operational side," he said, "what would I do?" It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, and she appreciated him for asking it honestly instead of turning it into a negotiating position. "You'd run the drivers and the wagons and the roads," she said. "You'd manage the physical operation. I'd manage the financial and contractual structure. We'd both manage the customer relationships, but you'd keep the primary ones, the ranches, the settlements, the people who trust you because you've shown up reliably for 10 years. He was quiet for a long time. "Marta's going to say I should have done this a year ago," he said finally. "Marta would be right," Evelyn said. He almost laughed. "Done," he said and put out his hand. She shook it. It was not a dramatic moment, a handshake across a desk that needed sanding, in an office with freight invoices stacked on every flat surface. But it was real, and it was hers in a way that Theo Marsh's office and the Pueblo land offices and all the borrowed rooms of her working life had never been. She was 33 years old, and she was, for the first time, not someone's bookkeeper. She was something harder to name and more accurate to her actual life. Garfield Prue's land dispute with the Northern Valley ranchers finally reached resolution that fall. It had taken the circuit court 14 months from the Calhoun family's filing to issue a decision, which was faster than anyone had expected and seemed to be partly attributable to the documentation, the freight records Evelyn had identified, the delivery pattern she'd charted, the chain of ownership analysis she'd prepared for Werner that had been included in the Calhoun's legal brief. The court found against Prue on the primary water rights claim and ordered the disputed access boundaries restored to the original grant descriptions. Prue did not leave the valley. He was not that kind of man. He had too much invested and too much pride, and Evelyn suspected not enough elsewhere to go. He became quieter, less expansive, the particular diminishment of a man who has discovered that the power he thought he had was contingent on no one looking too closely at it. Vance Hollowell, who had been allied with Prue's position at the civic meetings in a way that stopped just short of explicit, also became quieter. She noticed this and did not make anything of it, because making something of it would have been small, and she was trying not to be small. The Calhoun family came to her directly after the decision. The elder Calhoun, a lean, weathered man named George, who had been in the valley since before Jonah, came to the freight office one morning and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "I want to say thank you," he said, "for what you put together. Werner said without your freight documentation, the case was much harder to make." "Werner made the case," she said. "I gave him something to work with." "He said the same thing about you," George Calhoun said. He looked at her with the direct, evaluating look of an old man who has learned to take people's measure over a long life. "My wife wants to know if you and Jonah would come to supper." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. There was something in the invitation that was more than courtesy. It was the valley acknowledging something, accepting something, in the quiet way that frontier communities sometimes did when they decided a person was theirs. "We'd be glad to," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and left. She sat at her desk after he was gone and thought about the $83 and the road into Cimarron Valley and the flowers she'd seen on the hillside before she'd seen anything else, and how she'd almost kept riding straight through to whatever nameless place would take her. She thought about the specific chance of stopping, not destiny, not inevitability, just a thirsty horse and a moment of curiosity and the improbable fact of a man who planted beauty in ground that didn't reward it. She thought about how differently it could have gone, how easily she could have kept riding. She was glad she hadn't. Post died in November of that year. He died in his sleep, on his blanket by the stove, sometime in the early hours of a cold morning, and Jonah found him when he came down at 4:30 in the way he still did, before the rest of the world was ready to be awake. She heard him come back upstairs and stop in the doorway of the bedroom, and she was already half awake, and she looked at him in the dark and understood before he said anything. They buried him near the kitchen garden, in the ground where the garlic came up every spring. Jonah dug the hole, and they didn't say much about it, because Post had been 11 and a half years old and had lived a complete life, and there was nothing false to say about it. She stood beside Jonah in the cold November morning and thought about the old dog leaning his full weight into a scratch behind the ear, the absolute trust of an animal that had been saved from a fence post and had never had a single ambivalence about anything afterward. "He was a good dog," she said. "He was," Jonah said. They went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and the absence of the breathing shape by the stove was an ache in the room that they both felt and neither named, because some losses were just what they were, and naming them didn't help, and sitting with them did. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way he'd put his hand over hers in the February of the previous year, and they sat there in the cold morning with their coffee while the kitchen was too quiet. Their daughter was born the following October, on a Tuesday, during a rainstorm that had been going on since Sunday and showed no signs of apology. Her name was Ruth, after Jonah's aunt, which had been Evelyn's suggestion. Jonah had looked at her when she'd said it, and something had moved across his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not quite any expression she had a name for, just a quality of being very full of something. He'd said yes without hesitating, and that had been the end of the discussion. Ruth was born loud and had opinions from approximately the first day, which Evelyn felt was entirely appropriate. She had Jonah's gray eyes and Evelyn's stubbornness, a combination that would take 15 years to fully express itself, but that they both had inklings of early. She did not sleep well for the first 4 months, which meant neither did they, and the ranch ran imperfectly through that winter in the way that ranches run when the people running them are operating on interrupted sleep and divided attention. Things that would have been done on time got done late. The hay account for the first quarter was a mess that Evelyn straightened out in March, sitting at the kitchen table with Ruth asleep in the cradle next to her, working with one hand and rocking the cradle with the other. She was not a graceful new mother. She found parts of it harder than she'd expected, and she had a specific period, somewhere in the second month, of feeling so far from anything she recognized as herself that she told Jonah plainly one night that she wasn't sure she was doing it right, and she didn't have any way to measure it because she had never done it before. He'd looked at her for a moment. "Nobody has," he said. "That's not particularly reassuring." "I know," he said, "but it's true." He reached over and took Ruth from her because she'd been holding her for 3 hours and her arms were shaking slightly from the effort. "Go sleep for 2 hours," he said. "I'll take her." "You have to be up at 4:30. "I'll be up at 4:30, he said. "Go." She went. She slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes and woke up to silence, which meant Ruth was still asleep, and lay in the dark for a moment listening to the quiet and thinking that some problems didn't get solved so much as they got survived until they became something else. Ruth got easier. Not all at once, not in any linear way that could be charted, but in the accumulating way that things got better on a ranch, incrementally, through daily attention, until one day you looked up and realized the thing that had been hard was now simply part of what you knew. By the time Ruth was 3, the acre parcel hay was producing well enough that Jonah had been able to negotiate a supply contract with 2 of the larger ranches in the valley. The flower section on the lower acre land had done what the hillside section had done 7 years before, struggled through the first season, sent up thin and uncertain growth in the second, and then in the third year exploded into something that made a person stop and look. The section was twice the size of the original hillside planting and visible from the road, a wash of gold and violet and that dusty orange that Evelyn still didn't have an adequate name for, running along the rocky lower edge of the parcel in a band that looked from a distance like something that had always meant to be there. People started mentioning it. Travelers coming through on the valley road would slow down, the way Evelyn had slowed down that first October day. The Calhoun family's daughter, who was 17 and drawing everything she saw, asked Jonah one Sunday at supper if she could come out and sketch them. 2 ranches over, a woman who kept a kitchen garden had asked Evelyn what they were and whether she could have seeds. Evelyn had given her the seeds and then come home and told Jonah, and he'd said, with the mild surprise of a man who has done a private thing for a long time and is only now realizing other people have been watching, "She wants to grow them herself?" "She does," Evelyn said. "I gave her the envelopes from last fall's collection." He looked at the window, at the hillside. "All right," he said. He seemed genuinely uncertain how to receive this. Not uncomfortable exactly, but slightly unmoored, as if the flowers being someone else's interest required him to revise something about how he thought of them. "They'll do all right in her garden," he said finally. "The soil over there is thin enough." She looked at his profile. "Are you bothered by it?" she said. He thought about it. Actually thought, not just responded. "No," he said. "I think I thought of them as mine for a long time, but they're just plants," he paused. "If they grow somewhere else, that doesn't change what they are here." She thought about this for a longer time than it probably required, turning it over. There was something in it that felt true beyond the flowers. The way a thing you've built doesn't diminish when other people benefit from it. The way giving away a seed didn't leave you with less. She'd spent a lot of her working life in situations where information was held close because sharing it meant losing advantage, where competence was a resource to be protected rather than extended. She'd operated that way herself, longer than she liked to admit. Cimarron Valley had taught her something different, mostly by being a place small enough that you couldn't afford not to help your neighbor, and practical enough to have organized itself around that fact long before she arrived. "The freight business is the same way," she said. He looked at her. "What I built there," she said, "the route restructuring, the account systems, the supplier contracts. Cal has people who understand it now. Ed Rourke understands the operational side better than Cal does in some ways. The woman I trained to keep the books, she caught a billing error last month before I saw it. She paused. That used to be the thing that made me feel secure, being the one who caught it. Now it just feels like the thing is working. Jonah was quiet for a moment. That bothers you? He said. It surprised me, she said. I thought it would bother me more than it does. Ruth chose this moment to come in from the yard with mud on both knees and a rock she'd found that she considered significant, which she placed on the kitchen table with the gravity of a person presenting evidence. Jonah looked at the rock. Evelyn looked at the knees. Neither of them said anything for a moment. What kind of rock? Jonah said. Ruth looked at him with the expression of a 3-year-old who has been asked a question she doesn't have the vocabulary to answer, but has strong feelings about. A good one, she said. Okay, he said. He picked it up and examined it with genuine attention. You're right. It's a good one. Evelyn got up to deal with the knees. In the spring of their 5th year in the valley together, Ruth, 4 now, loud and curious, already following Jonah to the fence lines the way Evelyn had once watched him work from the road. They stood in the flower section of the acre parcel on a Saturday morning in May. Evelyn was showing Ruth how to set the seeds the way Jonah had shown her, the depth and the spacing and the reading of the soil, and Jonah was working further down the row, opening the ground ahead of them with the methodical steadiness she'd watched for years. Ruth was not a patient learner. She was enthusiastic, which meant she went too fast and pressed too hard, and had already dropped one envelope and scattered its contents across a section of ground in a way that was less planting and more throwing. Slower, Evelyn said. Feel the soil first. It's dirt, Ruth said, with the particular 4-year-old authority of someone who considers this observation definitive. It's dirt with things in it, Evelyn said. The things matter. Ruth considered this with a frown. She pressed her fingers into the soil the way Evelyn showed her and was quiet for a moment, actually feeling it. Then she looked up. What things? Water, minerals, old roots, the history of what grew here before. She looked at the section of ground. When your father planted the first flowers on that hillside, the soil up there was almost nothing. But it was the right kind of nothing for these particular seeds. They needed the hardness. Ruth looked at the hillside, where the flowers were already beginning to show their early season color. The same hillside that had stopped Evelyn on a road she'd been about to leave behind forever. Why? She said. Evelyn thought about how to answer this to a 4-year-old and then decided the 4-year-old answer was probably also the true answer. Because easy ground doesn't make them strong, she said. Hard ground makes them put roots down deep so they can come back. Ruth looked at the seed in her hand. She pressed it into the soil, more carefully this time, at something approximating the right depth. She patted the ground over it with her small, dirty palm. Will it come back? She said. Next year, Evelyn said, or the year after. Some of them take time. Ruth looked at the ground for another moment, then got up and moved down the row to help Jonah, which she did by handing him seeds one at a time from the envelope he gave her, narrating each one as she did it, a running commentary that Jonah received with the same steady attention he gave most things, not ignoring it, not performing interest in it, just genuinely present for it. Evelyn stayed where she was for a moment, kneeling in the turned earth of the acre parcel with her hands dirty and the May morning coming in warm from the south, and looked at the two of them working down the row. The man who had planted beauty in hard ground for 7 years before she'd stopped to look at it, and the child who would grow up thinking flowers in rocky soil were simply what the world contained. She thought about the woman she'd been on that road, the $83, and the particular hardness in her chest that came from being someone else's version of yourself for too long. The road behind her she had no intention of traveling again. She did not sentimentalize that woman. She'd been tired and uncertain and not particularly hopeful, and those were the facts. She'd also been, she now understood, exactly the right kind of tired, the kind that comes just before you stop doing the thing that's making you tired and start doing something else. She thought about all the specific chances. The boarding house woman who might not have mentioned the valley, the road that might have been clear enough that she hadn't stopped, the horse that had gotten thirsty at the right moment. She thought about Werner and the acre deed and the Calhoun water rights and Cal Alderman's counter to Harwick and Vance Hollowell going quiet in a room. She thought about Post asleep by the stove and Ruth's first loud night and the argument about the ledger structure and the fence mending and the 1,000 ordinary difficult days that didn't resolve into anything clean but accumulated into something real. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been what she'd planned. She had come to Cimarron Valley with a letter of introduction and no particular expectation, and had built, one imperfect season at a time, a life that was entirely her own. That was the thing she had not expected. Not the love, not the work, not the land. All of those she could have named as things she wanted. What she hadn't expected was the ownership of it. The specific feeling of standing in a life that was yours all the way through, that no one had given you or conditioned on your being manageable or convenient, that you had made from the actual material of your days. Some people searched their whole lives for a place that held them. She had almost ridden past hers. Down the row, Ruth handed Jonah a seed and said something that made him glance up with that expression she'd learned to read years ago. Not quite a smile, but the thing that came just before one. He looked toward Evelyn then, the look of a man checking that the person who mattered to him was still there, and she held up her hand and he nodded and went back to the row. She stayed on her knees in the good difficult earth for another moment, the sun on her back and the valley opening out around her in all directions. The creek shining in the distance, the cattle in the far pasture, the town 2 miles out with its smoke and its noise and its ordinary complicated human life. And then she got up and went to help with the planting. There was still a lot of ground to cover, there always was. But this was their ground, hard and flowering and entirely their own, and that made all the difference in the world.